Chapter 12. A small pool of light spilled from the open door of the elevator, illuminating dusty, rough tiles on the floor. The air was stale, and dry, and cold, and the silence seemed like something more. Like noise was a foreign thing here, muffled and suppressed. When they exited the door, the guard remained behind.
"Last chance to back out,"
he called. He truly did sound hopeful that they would take him up on his offer. Chesney lit a small flame in his hand. It barely reached a few feet around them. They stood as four pillars of light in a world of shadow.
"No, but thank you."
The guard shook his head sadly.
"Well then, good luck. I'll send the elevator right back down."
He pressed a button. The door closed, and the wan light vanished. Medea shivered. Her breath was a cloud of vapor. She was really hoping it would be much warmer down here. Though that folk remedy helped, she could still feel the edges of her cold.
Well, I guess we should start.
Dan and Zoran moved to the vanguard of the party. Dan smiled, though now his face was filled with professional determination.
"Stay behind us, and watch our backs."
Chesney blinked in surprise.
"All right. Thanks, guys."
Medea spoke quietly to him.
"Not used to people actually taking responsibility for our safety?"
He nodded.
"Yeah. Kinda a foreign concept to me. It's nice, though."
She agreed. They began to walk, everyone's nerves on high alert. The flame that Chesney could safely sustain was hardly adequate to reveal the whole room to them. From what he could see as they walked, this was once a finished structure. The tiles were crude, but uniform. There were short walls, most likely railings. Here and there, his light would illuminate some shape and startle her, but it was always some intact vase or statue on a cracked display. The soft padding of their feet on the tile barely seemed to make any noise. The darkness around them was at once both claustrophobic and cavernous. There were no echoes, but yet everything seemed so close. Suddenly, Chesney jumped.
"Did you hear that?"
he whispered harshly. Everyone stopped instantly, ears straining. After a time, they all exchanged head shakes. None of them heard anything.
"Sorry,"
he whispered, eyes still darting left and right.
"Let's just keep going."
Medea knew now that he sometimes heard and saw things because of his guilt. A place like this was bound to make something like that worse. She resolved to help him before it got out of control. She slowly and deliberately made a show of touching his shoulder so as not to startle him.
"It's okay. Keep your breaths even. Just look at their backs. Try to block out everything else."
His face twisted. She assumed he was chafing under the perception that he was seeing things or acting childish. When he looked at her, though, he seemed to understand and nodded. Sometimes they'd approach close enough to walls that their shadows loomed out the darkness over them in long, ghoulish forms. She would be startled and want to shrink away. But she had resolved to stay strong, to be a rock, to not be weak. And it was hard, but having someone else's struggle to focus on made it a little easier. She was close enough to notice every jerk of his head, the tiny, cautious, instinctual movements of his hand carrying the flame.
"Are you still hearing something?"
she asked.
"I don't know. I keep hearing little flutters, seeing things move out of the range of my light. It just feels different somehow than before. You really don't hear anything?"
She shook her head, her expression sad. She really wished she did. Making him feel like he was the odd one out was the last thing she wanted to do. Just then, Zoran quietly murmured,
"Dan, I got." "Right,"
Dan replied, before seeming to kick out on his right into the darkness. Amazingly, the blow struck something with a crack, and a high-pitched squeal was quickly followed by a thunk as some shape at the edge of light fell to the ground. Chesney turned his light towards it, and there, lying unmoving on the ground, was a creature that looked almost identical to the goblins that had attacked Fritz's cabin. Just then, the sound of small, clawed feet seemed to dash off in all directions. Dan turned to them and said,
"The scoundrels were quietly filtering in around us. just outside the reach of our light. If it had gone on much longer, they probably would have attacked.
Medea was astounded. She had no inkling that there was anything happening at all.
Amazing work, you two.
She bit her lip. She felt completely outclassed. To Chesney, she whispered,
Sorry, it looks like I'm useless down here. You all detected them, but I didn't sense anything.
But he furrowed his brow.
I'm not sure that's what I heard, though. What do you mean? I'm not sure. Just be careful. It's probably nothing. I can't trust my senses in a place like this.
Soon, they came to a set of stairs leading down. Duran pointed into the darkness beyond. There, almost too small to see, was a tiny little dot of greenish light. Chesney lowered the light to squint at it.
That looks like another one of those emergency containers, but it's on this same level. Was there any other way to go except down? No. Looks like this is the only way forward,
Dan said. The two mercenaries went first. Medea made Chesney stay in the middle, and she took up the rear as they descended. Almost all the way down, Chesney gasped and spun, looking into the air.
Chesney, what's wrong?
Medea whispered, jumping to his side.
I saw. It's impossible, but I saw just a face.
He was spinning, pointing the light of his fire in random directions, but nothing was revealed.
I'm going crazy. Medea, I can't trust myself down here. I know there's nothing there, but all I can feel is everyone watching me right outside the light.
He grabbed her hand and held it tight.
Just stay there and help keep me grounded.
His hands were freezing, and his breath was ragged, but she resolved to be there for him. She couldn't imagine what being here must be like for him. They found themselves on the lower level, their shadows flickering across crumbling walls and almost completely destroyed murals. The path was not straight. Here and there were dead ends, alcoves that at one point must have served some purpose but were now just barren. If the two mercenaries found the difficulties Chesney was facing odd, they kept it to themselves and kept their eyes peeled into the dark. There they came to a branching path. One seemed to lead closer to the green light, so they decided to go that way. As they made their way, though, Chesney's breathing grew faster and faster. There didn't seem to be anything Medea could do to keep him calm. She had an idea.
Chesney, I was thinking. Maybe we should make your light brighter. You'll be able to see more, and it will be harder for your mind to play tricks on you.
Through gritted teeth, he replied,
Are you sure it's okay? I'll start to get weaker.
She sent a cooling breeze of revitalizing energy into him through their clasped hands.
It will be okay. Trust me.
If he considered arguing, he didn't show it. He took a moment to nod, and then held his hand high in the air, tripling the size of the flames, lighting up the whole area from wall to wall. He screamed in terror. The air was filled with veiled, horrible things, bloated, purple, rotting heads, floating through the air, bobbing gently around them like monstrous jellyfish, their slick black hair plastered to their faces, or fluttering and reaching like tendrils, and all around them on the ground, shambling, transparent corpses with gaunt, skeletal faces. They were completely surrounded. Trembling, Chesney could only barely whisper,
I'm sorry, Emma. Chesney, I see them too. They're not hallucinations.
His face snapped to look at her.
Wait. You can see them? But how?
But by turning his attention to her, he missed that a group of the floating heads were snooping down at him.
Look out!
She cried, dragging him down and covering his body with hers. Duran's boomerang whistled overhead and sliced a deep gouge into their faces, sending them screeching away.
We see him too, kid,
he said.
Well, this is certainly a new one for me,
Dan said, brandishing his two tonfa and taking a stance.
Mom will never believe this.
Dan picked out a target, dashed forward, and did a forward flip to bring his leg crashing down on one of the approaching spirits. His leg passed through and almost seemed to dissolve and bisect it at the same time. The spirit howled in a voice that seemed to echo in their minds before utterly disappearing.
Fantastic. Didn't think that would work. How are things over there, Duran?
Duran just answered with a grunt as he whipped his boomerang through the air once more, striking another set of the ghastly floating beings. One of them screamed and melted into shadows. Medea was almost knocked aside as Chesney stood up on his own, unsheathing his weapon with a mad look in his eye.
If they're real, then I can fight them.
He dashed into the fray beside Dan and sliced his blade into one of the spirits that had begun to encircle Dan. Part of it seemed to just dissolve into nothingness, but then it howled in anger. The voice screamed in their heads, bringing everyone to a knee for just a moment. That moment was all the floating heads needed to swoop in and use their hair to scratch at them from above. Medea felt one ram her from behind and coiled its hair around her throat. In the melee, no one noticed. It dragged her up into the air, pulling her up by the neck, strangling her. Desperately, she tried to grab at the hair to hold herself up, and with the other, searched behind her to feel where the creature was. At last, she felt cold, slimy flesh, and kicked all her desperation into a vicious lightning bolt. The thing screamed and dissolved into shadow, dumping her to the floor. She lay in a heap, gasping for breath, swallowing hurt, but she grit her teeth and made ready with her bow. She put an arrow each into 2 heads. Neither were deterred. She aimed for a third, but she was knocked down by one of the transparent gaunt figures. Its mouth was impossibly wide, and it reached down at her. A sword appeared like a flash of light and turned it to vapor.
You okay?
Chesney asked, helping her up. She gulped a breath and replied, already readying another arrow.
Yeah, but there seems to be no end to these things.
The air began to fill with off-key, musical cackling. A group of the floating hags were circling together in the air. An arrow and a boomerang both narrowly missed them. The cackling crested in strength, and the air filled with some odd, spectral fire that only seemed to harm the party. It flowed out from the group of heads like a blast wave, knocking everyone away. Dan was knocked into a wall, but managed to stay upright. Duran, Chesney, and Medea were each knocked into the floor. Dan dashed over to Chesney and Medea's side, helping them up. Duran limped over. They had taken out a handful of enemies, but it seemed like the number surrounding them was growing.
Plan?
Duran ground out, while holding on to the boomerang like a dagger and slashing at the encroaching horde to keep them at bay.
I have an idea,
Chesney said,
but I need a minute. Can you guys keep them distracted? I'll protect you, no matter what,
Medea said, gritting her teeth and turning to face the horde of monsters. Chesney nodded and closed his eyes, holding his hands apart in front of him, concentrating. Duran closed his eyes a moment, and a glittering field appeared over Chesney's frame. Then he too turned his back to Chesney and faced their foes.
All right, young man, we are counting on you,
Dan said, a great big smile on his face. He seemed to be enjoying himself immensely as he took on 2 spirits and a floating head at once, deftly dodging between their blows and using his momentum to strike devastating blows with his legs and blocking with his 2 tonfa. Above, another set of the floating hags began to chant once more.
Oh no, you don't,
Medea yelled, launching 3 bolts of lightning in quick succession. With her attention divided, though, it left Chesney open. A pair of 2 spirits, hands like bony claws, lunged towards him. Unable to do anything else, Medea dove in front to take the blows. 4 great bloody claw marks raked down her back, and she screamed. One of them grabbed her ankle and yanked her to the ground. Duran saw her being dragged away, and deftly flicked his boomerang, carving a deep gash in 2 of the spirits and completely severing the spectral arm of the spirit grabbing her. She kicked away and rolled painfully to her feet, taking another protective stance before Chesney.
Thanks, Duran,
she panted. She saw his leg was bleeding a lot, and his movement were slowing down. Still, he deftly caught the boomerang as it returned to him. I can't imagine what kind of skill you'd need to effectively use a weapon like that in a crowd like this. This has got to be the power of a true mercenary, she thought.
Almost. There. Get ready,
Chesney called from their center. 2 spirits on either side of the group simultaneously wailed, and everyone's minds racked with pain and staggered, but none fell. To Medea, everything was starting to get blurry and indistinct. Almost there. Just hold on. Chesney can do it. A strange high-pitched noise was beginning to fill the air, but she couldn't place where it was or what was happening. A floating head swooped down and tried to take a straight run through Medea, right at Chesney.
No, you don't,
she screamed, and managed a front kick strong enough to send it off course and past them.
Everyone, get down. Now,
Chesney yelled, and everyone fell to the ground, covering themselves as best they could. The high-pitched noise increased in intensity, and a fraction of a second after Chesney called out, the air was at once filled with tiny motes of light. With a snap of his fingers, all the lights began to explode in small, localized explosions. Their locations were random and indiscriminate, but from the sheer number of them it was almost impossible for any of the creatures to not be hit by at least one. The throng of monstrous ghosts all howled and screeched and dissolved into nothingness or vapor or shadow. Dust and rubble fell everywhere, disturbed from the ceiling, walls, and floor. All at once, there was darkness and silence. Then, Chesney groaned and fell to his side, panting.
Nang, that's I've never... Ow.
He at once tried to regain his footing but fell over again. Heedless of her own injuries, Medea turned and crawled to his side, and began to fill his body with the healing energy of Sophie's crown.
It's okay, just keep breathing.
With audible relief in his voice, he said,
Thank you. I meant to say, I've never had a spell take so much of my life before. It felt like my heart skipped a few beats there. Impressive, kid,
Zoran said, taking a breath and sitting down to rest and take a look at his leg. After taking a few breaths, Dan agreed.
Wow, they really aren't kidding about spiritualists being in a league of their own.
It was then that Chesney looked and saw her wounds.
Medea, you need to take care of yourself first. I am fine. I just needed to make sure that what you just did wasn't too much. I'll do myself now.
Medea lay on the ground and focused on all her wounds individually. The bruise around her neck, the gashes on her back, the burns, the splitting migraine from the howling specters wailing. It wasn't until now, after it was all over, that the true gravity of the situation really started to fall on her. Those things. What were they? Were they all dead things? Or something else? One thing she knew, though, was that without Dan and Zoran, they would not have survived that encounter. No matter how much she would have protected him, it wouldn't have been enough. Despite everything, despite all her strength and will, her determination to keep Chesney safe, she would have failed. And it made her so scared. Chesney distributed some of the pills from the paracetamol bottle to everyone, but kept looking back at her, like he was thinking about something. When he was done, he rejoined her.
So, how is it using the crown? No side effects? Or does it feel diminished at all?
She put the rest of her feelings away and shook her head.
No, amazingly, I feel great, and the power from the crown seems totally unchanged. Honestly, I think we can stop worrying about it. I don't think Sophie would have used something like that if it was harmful, you know?
After a moment of thought, he nodded.
All right. I trust your opinion on this. And how are you doing? About all these spirits in this dark and everything?
The easiest way for her to get past her own fears was to help Chesney work through his. Having his fears made manifest like that had to be horrible. To her astonishment, he looked relieved.
Really, after the nightmare, and talking to you about it, and finding Juliet, I thought I was finally getting over everything. Like I knew that there were other forces at play that had a hand in what happened, that it wasn't all on me. But then, down here, it just felt like it was all rushing back. It felt like I was going crazy. But when you and Zoran said you saw them too, it was like a switch flipped, and I could control myself again. So yeah, I think I'm okay now.
With everyone rested and back on their feet, they continued down the lower path until they found a set of stairs that led them to a little alcove with the emergency chest with the small green light in front.
Oh, can I open this one?
Medea asked, slightly embarrassed look on her face. They look like fun.
Go ahead.
Chesney chuckled, stepping aside.
I've been hogging them all, haven't I?
She grinned uncontrollably, pressing the button on the front and watching the strange chest open like an iris with a soft whisper. This one had some decayed tools in it, but on top of them was a dusty, slightly scratched device in otherwise great condition. It was rectangular and flat. The outer edge of it was silver, with some embossed design of lines and knots around the outside, and the inner rectangle was black and featureless. When she picked it up, it flickered to life. In her surprise, she almost dropped it. The black featureless rectangle was now glowing with light and displaying something. Most of it was blue, but there were 2 big blobs of yellow and green, with flashing red dots over everything, and a few blobs of color here and there as well.
What am I even looking at here?
The 3 men all stooped over the device in her hand. Chesney quickly said,
It seems to be a map of Lennis. We had a big one on the wall at school.
Dan interjected, holding his chin in thought.
Correct, but it's the most detailed map I've ever seen. Look here.
He pointed to what must have been Sasquatch.
I think these are clouds, and they're moving. And look here, over where I think Zoran is. It's a big dark splotch. And these flashing red dots must be cities. There are even ones for the cities in Sasquatch. No map I've ever seen has had that.
In wonder, Medea asked aloud,
Is this a live map of Lennis?
Even Zoran was amazed. He pointed to a flashing red dot on the screen.
It has to be. I know this settlement. It's only existed for a few decades. There's no way a map from the ancient past would have a spot for it. It even shows terrain. Incredible.
She gasped.
This has to be another artifact from the Immortals. To think something like this existed 10,000 years ago. But what's wrong?
Chesney asked.
But it was so long ago. The Great Ones, they came and shared so much with everyone. Shouldn't we be so much more advanced than we are now? After all this time? Shouldn't things like this be commonplace now?
Chesney's eyebrows furrowed.
You're right. Everything they left us still works. Amazingly. But we haven't gotten close to doing anything like it ourselves. And why did they leave? Where did they go? Why would they leave something dangerous like Dahlgren behind?
She sighed.
All we seem to find is more questions.
This map is incredible, but I feel like there's a big clue I'm missing. How is something like this even possible? And why is Lennis so far behind? And where did this crown come from? Was it Sophie? Why couldn't she explain, instead of leaving me in the dark? Chesney squeezed her shoulder.
I think we're close to getting some answers. Medea. As mad as I am at this Daphne person, I really believe she will know something. Yeah, you're right. I'm just frustrated.
Just then, Zoran touched them both softly, then gestured for silence. He then pointed into the darkness, south. There were voices.
You said. Tell them that.
The guard would have told us if there was anyone else who had come before. So, who are these people, and how did they get in? And most importantly, what are they doing down here? Zoran touched a finger to his lips, and beckoned them to follow him silently. Together they followed the stairs down, along another deep path, and up another set of stairs. The voices kept growing louder, and eventually Medea could make out that it was a man and woman, arguing about something up ahead. Just cresting the stairs, they could see that up ahead was a dimly lit area before some kind of statue. The statue was indistinct without any strong features, other than long ears. Just below it, on the pedestal upon which it rested, was a small hollow with the same pattern as the jewels on Sophie's crown. Below the hollow, there was something that may have been an access panel that had been pried open. And standing in front of that statue, along with a floor full of tools and a worklight, was a fée or the man and woman. They were arguing animatedly, seemingly heedless to the amount of noise they were making. Evidently, they didn't think there was a possibility they would be noticed. Their clothes were oddly colorful and flamboyant. She wore a crown-like headdress, gold pauldrons, and a billowy white and pink cloak over top a bright red dress. The man had a strange electronic device covering both his eyes, and a very loose green shirt and pant. His belt was gold and seemed to be very ornamental and reminded her of a wrestler's championship belt. The woman's expression was quite severe, and she seemed to be in charge. Zerine and Dan exchanged a quick glance, then stepped in front of Chesney and Medea. Dan shouted,
"Stop right there! What do you think you're doing?"
and assumed a combat-ready stance. The woman sighed and turned to face the party. In an unfamiliar accent, she muttered,
"Wonderful! Look what your bungling has gotten us."
He looked back and saw what was happening, growled, dropped his tools, and stood beside her in a stance that closely resembled Dan's.
"Pa, we would have been home by now, if you had just listened to me. Enough whining. Just kill them."
In the blink of an eye, the man dashed forward, flipped, and landed a double kick that knocked both Dan and Zerine off their feet. Seeing this, Chesney rushed forward to block a crushing heel aimed at Dan's head with his shield. The force of the blow drove Chesney to a knee, and with that almost everyone was on the floor or off balance. Medea gestured in front of her, aiming a bolt of lightning at the man. It struck home on his chest, but he hardly seemed fazed by the damage as he jumped back away from the men on the ground.
"Ah, a spiritualist.
The woman purred.
I suppose I shall help as well."
With a vicious swipe of her hand, a huge wall of fire exploded away from her and blew them all away. Dan and Zerine, who were getting to a knee, were both blown over and given nasty burns. Chesney also took the full force of the blow and screamed. The male fée wasted no time, dashing in just behind the fire and landing quick, precise blows on everyone, ending with a brutal kick to Medea's solar plexus, and almost sending her flying over the nearby railing. She managed to stay on the platform, but the wind had been knocked out of her, and all she could concentrate on was finding her next breath. That last attack gave Dan the moment he needed, and in a smooth motion he kicked out his leg to trip the man while using the momentum to flip to his feet. To Dan's amazement, the fée took the blow, rolled away and ended on his feet as well. Dan said, admiration in his voice.
"Impressive. I would have enjoyed facing you in a tournament. Shame I have to kill you here." "Interesting. You think you can? I want to see it,"
he replied coolly, in a strange accent, and the two set upon each other with moves far too swift and precise for Medea to even properly track.
"Pa, and I'll just handle the other three, shall I, Vensk?"
The well-dressed woman spat in disgust, shaking her head. Chesney and Zerine stood side by side, looking for an opening to approach her. Whenever one would take a step, she would blast out a concentrated spray of fire that would drive them back. If they tried to flank her, a wide blast would turn them away. Medea, finally able to breathe after the previous attack, snuck behind them and whispered,
"Zerine, distract her for a second."
He snapped to, and rolled to the side to throw his boomerang. While the woman was distracted deflecting it, he said to Chesney,
"Here, bait her to attack you, then go all in."
She placed a hand on him and applied a shimmering veil. It was the magic that would repel part of the damage back at the attacker. He nodded and yelled a battle cry, getting ready to endure the pain of her fiery onslaught as he dashed forward, sword glinting in the firelight. As predicted, she sent a concentrated spray of fire right at him, but this time part of it was turned away and struck her as well. She screamed at the unexpected fire, though much of it blew harmlessly off of her clothes.
"Damn brat!"
Without a moment of hesitation, Chesney shook off the blistering heat that prickled over his skin and thrust his sword straight at her. She was impaled in the chest to the hilt. The shock on her face mirrored Chesney's. They both looked down at the blade, as dark blood began to seep out and soak her dress. The Fiorla man screamed.
"Prish! Damn you!"
But the distraction was enough. Dan performed a double strike to the gut on the man, before finishing him off with a high kick to the head. The crunch was very final sounding, and the power of the blow sent him over the rail behind him, where he fell to the floor like a rag doll. The female spiritualist of fire grit her teeth, the paleness of her skin now offset with bright crimson blood flowing between her teeth.
"For Lord Zagos."
Her hands filled with fire, and she thrust them at Chesney. She put everything she had left into the attack, and protection or no, Medea knew it would be a terrible attack. She rushed to his side, grabbed him by the waist, and pulled him down so she could cover him. The incredible fire washed over them both, and reflected back at the witch. All three screamed in agony, until at last, the woman was spent and collapsed, never to move again. The two of them lay on the ground, trembling in pain as their skin smoked and burned. The hot pool of blood from the witch touched them, and they both yelped. Gently, Durin and Dan took the minisatamol from Chesney's belt, and administered a double dose to each of them. The agony subsided, and they were able to regain their footing. Though his burns were cured, Chesney stood ram-straight and unmoving, like he was scared the next movement would hurt. Then she saw that he was looking down at the body of the witch.
"Chesney, what's wrong?"
she asked. He just shook his head.
It's nothing. Really."
Duran, though, elbowed past her and knelt down between him and the body.
"Listen. It's okay to feel horror. Was this your first time killing a person?"
Stiffly, Chesney nodded. "Oh God, I never even thought. We've fought and killed so many creatures and monsters, but never people."
"It's going to be tough, but it gets easier."
After a time, Chesney whispered,
"Should it?" "No, but try to hold on to that thought for now. You did nothing wrong. They would have killed you. They would have killed all of us, if they had the chance. Always remember, it's them, or you. Them, or you."
Duran then quickly withdrew the sword from her chest, and quickly wiped it down and put it in Chesney's scabbard, carefully keeping himself between the boy and the gruesome sight.
"Go on, take a few minutes."
Chesney nodded dumbly, and walked to a railing looking away. Dan moved to help Duran toss her body out of sight, while giving an appreciative head nod. Medea took the moment of calm to cure everyone's worst wounds before going to join Chesney at the rail.
"Hey, Chesney. Can we talk?"
she said, not really sure what to say. She had been around death and responsibility her whole life. Wild animals, bandits, and the crown of authority her people seemed to have placed on her head. She knew that if she had landed the killing blow, she would not have bat an eye. Part of that scared her, but she also knew she relied on, needed, that part of herself to go on. So, she didn't know what she could say that didn't sound crass or heartless. Maybe she shouldn't say anything. After a handful of heartbeats, he replied,
"Yeah, I think we should."
What came out of his mouth next shocked her.
"We need to discuss your behavior recently, Medea." My what? Wait. My behavior? Chesney, I don't understand."
And she truly didn't. She was expecting a conversation about life and death, and how responsibility sometimes gets in the way of your own ideals. But she truly has no idea what he was trying to say.
"Ever since Hagado, I've noticed a shift in your behavior, and it worries me. I just haven't known how to bring it up, but I can't put it off any longer."
Duran and Dan exchanged puzzled looks behind them, but remained quiet and unobtrusive.
"Chesney, what do you mean? You're scaring me. What did I do?"
Is he tired of me? Is he trying to cast me away? Am I not useful enough after all? Am I still such a burden that I'm dragging everyone down? She thought back to the 2 recent fights, where she could barely contribute, being knocked around or dragged out of the fight, needing to be rescued. She bit her lip, the worry building inside her like a nauseating lump in the pit of her stomach.
Down in the well, you used your last strength to help me. In almost every encounter since we left Hagudo, you've been beside me, taking blows for me, shielding me, prioritizing me. But that's just common sense. If I don't...
He held a finger up to her lip.
No, this goes beyond sense and strategy. There's something else at play here that I don't think I fully understand, but you're putting yourself into danger needlessly, Midia. And if you're not careful, you're going to die.
The accusation struck home in the most crippling way possible. She staggered to respond, to refute it as a lie, but being called out so effectively, she was struck dumb. She had been prioritizing him. She had to keep him safe, no matter what, but nothing could come out of her mouth, like admitting it was wrong. Gently, Chesney put his hands on her shoulders.
I know things are going to be rough and dangerous, that inevitably you and I are going to get hurt, but if you die protecting me, I will never, ever forgive myself for letting that happen. Okay? Just promise me. You won't do that. No trying to keep me safe from everything, no matter what. Okay?
She wanted to protest. There were times when he could have been killed without her intervention, like with the black bomb. But she also knew that she was also doing it when it wasn't so life-threatening. Taking blows meant for him, making sure he was completely cured before she ever thought about herself. Chesney was right. Maybe she was going too far. She couldn't voice it though, as though voicing it was making it too real. There were too many things lying under the surface. Too many hurts and worries and regrets and responsibilities clawing to come out. It was too much. Not now. She managed.
Okay.
And bit her lip. Her mind danced across so many ways to elaborate how she understood, and would try to do better, but she just couldn't open her mouth to say anything more. He stared into her eyes for a moment longer, until he nodded like he could feel her internal struggle. Or maybe he simply decided something for himself, and accepted her word. She was grateful to him for not pushing any more. She was about to turn away when he caught her once more.
Wait, I also wanted to say, thank you. Midia, you, willingly, shielded me from an awful, brutal fire attack. Do you realize how much willpower something like that takes? I just wanted you to know. You're absolutely incredible. You matter too, okay?
She blushed furiously and could only nod.
Alright, I'll just do the thing now,
she said, feeling foolish for being the center of attention. She took the crown off her head and pressed it into the depression below the statue. For a moment, it seemed to lock in place, while a strange noise came from the open panel below. The next moment, lights around the idol turned on, followed by more and more lights all over the underground temple. Far off in the distance, there were screeches and skittering noises all rushing away. The lights were strong, far too strong, and unflattering to the architecture. Midia surmised their intended use was to aid in excavation efforts. Moments later, a beep sounded, and Midia was able to remove the crown from the socket. She put it back on her head. Chesney nodded.
At least that seemed to go well. I had my doubts after all that fiddling.
He gestured to the tools below, kicked them away, and closed the panel.
All right, let's go back and let them know what was going on. And he'd better have that pass ready.
Dan gave a tired smile.
I knew following you would be interesting, Chesney, but I didn't know all the fun would start before we even left town.
Midia took the moment to say something, as they walked back.
I just wanted to say, thank you both for your help. We really appreciate everything so far.
Duran snuffed and almost imperceptibly shook his head.
Don't need to thank us, just doing the job. Well,
Chesney said,
I'll just say you're redeeming mercenaries in my eyes by the minute, and leave it at that. Now, let's get out of here before something else jumps out at us and scares me half to death.
With the lights on, the underground temple wasn't nearly so scary. Medea even had the chance to admire some of the bizarre wall murals. She really wished they had the time to really look them over, but that was selfish. As promised, the elevator was at the bottom waiting for them. The sickly yellowish light and oppressive atmosphere seemed completely gone, and they all casually entered the conveyance and began to ascend.
You really are incredible, by the way,
Chesney whispered to her.
What do you mean?
She asked, whispering back.
Watching out for me, protecting me, saying all the right things when I can't but should, just everything. I appreciate it a lot. I just wanted you to know I notice, you know?
She nodded, smiling.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand. And, I'm sorry I worried you. I really will try to be more sensible.
Chesney, you're the amazing one. Every day, something new stands in your way and tries to break you, but you never stop. You always do the right thing, even when it's hard and you don't want to or shouldn't have to. And that's why I'll always be by your side. The elevator slowed to a stop, and the door snapped open to a scene of chaos. Shouting, running, papers everywhere. Desks and pews knocked over. Blood on the floor. And right in front of the doors to the elevator, cowering like a puppy, was the mayor.
Oh, thank goodness you came back. It's awful, just awful,
he cried, shivering before them. They all left the elevator and looked around. Everywhere were signs of battle and destruction. The 3 guards that they had seen here earlier were all slain, surrounded by bloodstains and the bodies of 2 cloaked figures.
What happened? We haven't been gone that long,
Chesney said, awed by the scene before them.
Oh, some rabble calling themselves the Revolutionary Army burst in and took over the floating temple. They killed all the guards and chased away all my staff. They say they're going to bring the whole thing down. Please, you have to hurry and stop them. Return the power to the temple before it's too late. Drain's long history is at stake.
Medea wanted to slap that fool of a mayor and tell him how much these problems were because of his own terrible leadership. But before she could even speak, Chesney had rushed off. He pushed past the mayor and rushed to the elevator that would take them up.
Wait up,
she cried, running after him and avoiding stepping on anything that would break her ankle. They all crammed inside and began to ascend. The car swayed violently in the storm, and the lights were ever so slightly dimmer, blinking whenever the shaft was jostled too strongly.
I should have charged 800,
Duran muttered to himself.
Such a softie. Haha, indeed. We are certainly earning our keep today.
Dan chuckled beside him. Behind the banter, their faces were dead serious. She couldn't be more grateful to have them at her side. The doors opened. More blood, more bodies, more carnage. 2 more guards seemed to have been cut down here, deep gashes across their chests. Around them were 3 more robed figures, also on the ground, unmoving. Unfortunately, there were still 2 more who were still very much alive and noticed their arrival. 2 swords hung out of their scabbards, and the figures immediately dashed at the party. This time Dan and Zoran were ready and turned away both slashes, pushing the attackers back to give everyone the room to exit.
Support us from the rear, you 2,
Zoran barked. Medea gestured to Zoran.
Speed up.
And suddenly the blows that he had to block, he could now dodge. Chesney apparently decided that this battle required precision, and so used single lightning bolt strikes to harass the enemy and avoid hitting their friends. Dan had a much easier time keeping out of the reach of the revolutionary fighter, seamlessly moving in step with the blows, turning them aside and turning his momentum against him. With a quick movement of Dan's hand and foot, he managed to get his foot behind the attackers, and push his chest to send him falling. The fighter landed badly, cursing in pain, but his hood fell away. Medea gasped.
And a Lorne. Grr, damn fool.
The other fighter growled, flipped back out of Zoran's range, and helped his companion to his feet. They both took off their robes, now that their disguises had failed. The one who had fallen spat,
"Now we can fight properly. Now you die."
And they both rushed in with renewed speed and precision. Both of them dashed through the center of their formation and slashed out with their steel. None of them escaped uninjured, though Medea and Dan took the worst of it. Dan's martial arts uniform was darkening with blood from his side, and as for Medea, the cut had landed precisely between two protective plates.
"Don't you lay a finger on her,"
Chesney yelled, hitting them both with an intense blast of fire. There was no defense from the fire, and they both screamed, before one went low and the other leapt high to strike at him simultaneously. A boomerang sliced through the air at the one coming from above. The attacker parried the blow, sending the boomerang clattering to the floor, but his strike at Chesney had been turned aside. Chesney managed to bring his sword down to block the attack coming from below, but still got a nasty wound to his thigh. The Alorn was forced to back off, though, when an arrow from Medea whistled past his ear. One of them growled,
"Who are these guys?"
The other sighed.
"You don't read the reports at all, do you? Quit blabbing and just kill them, fool."
Zurin had retrieved his weapon and flung it at them once more, this time scoring 2 long thin gashes on the skin just above their brows, which began to bleed immediately. One then brought down a strong 2-handed slash down on Medea, but Dan jumped in the way and took another nasty slash to the chest in her place. The other dove at Chesney once more, and they locked blades, rather than be locked into a battle of strength. The Alorn released his pressure and then punched Chesney hard in the face as he stumbled, knocking him to the floor. The Alorn stood poised to bring his sword down as a coup de grace upon the boy. Medea couldn't even gasp out a warning. On instinct, she sent a sizzling bolt of lightning to strike him in the side of the head. The fighter fell in a heap, dead, his skin sizzling on his temple. For her trouble, a kick to her throat from the other sent her to the floor, gasping for air. The pain was incredible. It was beyond anything she had experienced. Such brutality. Her entire world became focused on straining to get the next breath, and the next.
"Damned witch!"
But that was the most he could do, because Dan was upon the remaining combatant, delivering ferocious blows, with seemingly no window to counter.
"You don't hurt ladies!"
Dan shouted, grimly punctuating each word with another blow, until at last the sword was forced from his adversary's hand. Dan lifted his heel straight up in the air, and then crashed it upon the stunned Alorn's head. Hill's neck completely collapsed with a sickening squelch, and he too fell dead. Haltingly, Medea picked herself up from the floor. She tried to thank Dan for taking such a wound for her, but was only able to rasp and wince. Her neck had taken quite the beating today. They took a brief moment to tend to their wounds. The floor shifted beneath them. The shaking was much worse than when they had been here before. Who knew how much time they had left? Chesney pointed upstairs, through the glass floor and walls, at 2 shapes at the top of the structure.
"I'm guessing that's where the other idol is. But what are Alorns doing here? How did they even get here? I thought the checkpoint has been closed this whole time."
Zurin nudged the corpses with his foot.
"I don't think this revolutionary army was entirely people from Jurian. I recognize a few faces from the bar as people I saw last time I was in Jurian, but obviously these Alorn are new."
Medea connected the dots.
"Of course, they've been here the whole time, riling up the townspeople to give them the pretext and cover to storm the Sky Temple, and bring it down. And look closer. Chesney, do you recognize those 2 up there?"
He looked up through the glass at the 2 shapes near where the idol must be.
"You're right. It's those 2 from the SAAS Squat Diplomatic Corps."
Dan shook his head.
"Looks like the mayor closed of the checkpoint far too late."
Chesney sighed.
"If they were even truly stopped by it at all. Come on, we need to hurry. If they destroy that idol, this whole city will be destroyed."
Bruised, burned, and bloodied, they all ran up the stairs, past the mayor's office, to a chamber at the top of the spherical structure. All around it, flashing in the rain and lightning and straining with the winds, were the massive petals of the Sophie lily structure, with this clear glass stamen in the center. and here at the top was a reverent temple dedicated to Rega. The floor depicted a world, held by soft hands. The walls, all ornamentally designed to draw attention to the back of the room, where a beautiful idol statue was framed by an intricate metal design of dozens of golden rays. Behind it, stained glass windows glowing in a golden yellow. The pillar that held the idol had a small panel at the base of it, much like the one in the Temple of Raya had, with wires and other incomprehensible circuitry visible within. And standing in front of the idol were the 2 Fiorilla members of the SAS Quat Diplomatic Corps they had seen at the inn. Their official-looking and ornamental attire had been replaced with serious armor. Both of them wielded 2 very long swords in a make Medea hadn't seen before. They weren't run-of-the-mill weapons turned out to outfit an army. They were unique, well-crafted, elite. The eyes of the 2 Fiorilla echoed the same sentiment. These 2 were not soldiers. They were killers, assassins, highly trained agents.
It was you 2. You and the Alorns, and whoever else from Sakowat. You started this rebellion. Why? Why are you attacking us?
Chesney snapped. Unfaltering conviction in his voice, one said,
Lord Zagos has ordered that Jerain be destroyed, and no one will stop us from making that happen.
The other joined in.
Jerain will perish, and what meaningless defense Nasquat can muster will perish with it.
They both shouted in unison.
For the future! For unity! For Lord Zagos!
And rushed the party with brandished weapons gleaming in the light of the temple. She knew the attack was coming, but even so, the sheer ferocity and speed at their disposal was humbling. As though the agents knew exactly what would happen next, had been preparing for this single blow their whole lives. The pair of them fought as one and in fluid motions danced right past everyone's defenses and left deep wounds in everyone. When the blade sank into her flesh, it was so much of a shock that she was struck dumb. Every move she had thought of and planned, all her priorities, they were just gone. All she could feel was the blade passing into her, deep, and that sudden panic realization that she could die. No, that she would die right here, right now. She shrieked in horror and backed away. There was no shame. She didn't admonish herself for not being a rock, for focusing on what she needed to do. These men were, killers said. They were all going to die. Dan and Chesney had also taken terrible wounds from the initial volley, but miraculously Zoran had stood firm and was ready for a counterattack despite him being just as badly wounded. The momentum the pair had used to make their devastating attack was also stopping them from being able to make any effective dodging maneuvers, which Zoran exploited by whipping his boomerang down at the legs of one of them. It didn't cause him to trip, but he did stumble and was completely off balance for the flying knee that Zoran launched into, finally sending one of the agents sprawling to the floor. The other turned quickly and engaged Zoran while his companion regained his footing. Amazingly, Zoran punched, jabbed it, and grabbed his way to taking only superficial cuts from the double-bladed onslaught.
Medea!
He shouted, not taking his eyes off his foe for a moment.
The others! Focus! Now!
As though she was struck by electricity, she started at having her name shouted. It snapped her out of her panic and gave her something to focus on. The others. Help the others. Get up. Now. Blood was leaking from her side, but with a goal in mind she paid it no heed as she rushed to Chesney's side. His leg was open and bleeding everywhere. He was panicking, trying to hold the wound closed with slippery hands. She pressed her hands down onto the wound, hard, and pushed every ounce of energy the crown would give her into sealing the wound. When her hands came away, his flesh had knit itself back together, leaving a handprint-shaped indent.
No, you don't,
he shouted, raising his hand in the air from his prone position, blasting fire into the face of the agent that had secretly gotten to his feet and was about to cut Medea down. The agent screamed and turned aside, wiping at his eyes.
Medea, Dan, hurry!
Chesney shouted, flipping to his feet in his own pool of blood, and rushing to take on his opponent before he could go and overwhelm Zoran. Trying not to slip, she ran to Dan's side, who was somehow, Worse. The cut wasn't as deep as Chesney's, but his neck had been nicked and blood was pouring between his fingers. The look in his eyes told Medea he had just been sent to the dark place she was desperately trying to stay out of. Again, she pressed down on the wound, hard, and poured everything she could into the wound. This one sealed quickly. Thank the immortals.
Help Chesney,
she pleaded. The wild, panicked look in his eyes subsided. He nodded shakily, once, and then flipped to his feet and chased after them. This time, she did feel shame. Both Zoran and Chesney certainly needed help in this desperate fight for survival, but if there was one thing she needed, it was to know he would be safe. Suddenly, her head felt far too light, and there wasn't enough air in the whole room for her to breathe. She looked down at her side. Had that wound always been so wide? She fell to the floor, into the pool of blood, grasping her side with her arm and concentrating. Sophie, please, I don't know how this works, but please, don't fail me now. With that same, miraculous, seemingly limitless power, her wounds sealed and she could think again. It was chaos. Dan and Chesney were both taking on one of the agents, and only barely keeping their ground. They were panicked. She could see it now. One of them would make a mistake, and the other would see it and intervene to cover. The agent was cool, testing their defenses and making sure to keep them off balance. He was completely in control and just wearing them down. Zoran was bloody from a dozen shallow cuts, but his agent couldn't land a solid blow. They danced a deadly tango, with the agent seemingly going through a long practiced set of moves, and Zoran constantly anticipating and turning deadly blows into near misses. But he wouldn't last forever. Medea focused on the agent, that familiar feeling of everything being made of sand. Time seemed to slow. She saw the movements, the cause, to effect, to effect, to effect, the slow chain of action and reaction. There. Instantly, a thick bolt of lightning arced from Medea's finger to a muscle on the agent's side. The exact timing of the blow caused the man to completely lose his footing from the muscle contraction, and sent him crashing to the floor. His sword slid across the floor in 2 different directions.
Zoran, here,
she yelled, tossing him a pill from her bottle of minoxidil, and then she ran to help with the other agent. Zoran caught it and ate it in a single smooth motion, and then turned to raining down blow after blow on the prone agent before he could get up. Things had finally turned with Dan, Chesney, and their agent. With the pommel of both swords, the agent had surprised them both, knocking them back. She could see what would happen next, and ran faster, but she wouldn't be there in time. Both swords crashed down on Chesney.
No!
She screamed, leapt, and planted a flying kick solidly into the agent's face from the side while he was completely committed to the strike, and defenseless. Dan recovered quickly, planted his foot, and braced the agent so he would take the full brunt of the kick and fall to the floor.
Help Chesney. I have got this.
She quickly pivoted and rushed to him. Chesney coughed but began to rise on his own. The twin swords had left awful gashes in his armor, but he wasn't seriously injured. Still, blood from 2 cuts to his head were smeared all over his face and down his front.
We need to get our footing in this fight, or we're going to lose,
he panted, out of breath from always being on the defensive. Medea placed her hands on him, and bestowed him with speed.
Go with Dan. I'll help Zoran. Stay calm. Don't let him attack you both at the same time.
The 2 parted, and ran to their battles. The agent Zoran was fighting was now standing, holding one blade with both hands. Out of the corner of her eye she noticed the other sword was shattered. Zoran must have destroyed it. The agent was hardly challenged, however. What before was a flurry of quick, precise blows, now became a storm of brutal slashes. His 2-handed sword technique was just as skilled as his dual-wielding one, and she had no doubt that his martial arts skills would be as well, should he lose this weapon. Zoran had changed tactics as well. He would whip his boomerang in seemingly random directions, only to dodge one way and another that would lead the agent into taking the blow from it on the return trip. Even those times when the agent would try to psych out Zoran's movements, those times seemed to be anticipated and ended up being scored hits as well. Unfortunately, the strength of the boomerang was not up to the challenge of piercing all the armor. He was scoring hits, but barely any wounds. Medea saw the way the battle was moving and positioned herself where the agent's line of sight would soon be obscured with Zoran between them. She yelled out,
"Look out!"
hoping Zoran could predict what she meant, and blasted another bolt of lightning towards them. Thankfully, Zoran was quick to understand and dodged around the heavily armored Fiorella, letting the blast hit him head-on. The agent was blasted backwards, narrowly missing being impaled by the metallic architecture of the room.
"Heya!"
Dan yelled, and out of nowhere the other soared through the air and landed close to the battered agent. Chesney ran forward.
"Medea, with me, now!"
he yelled, focusing all his attention on the two agents quickly rising, with hands outstretched. In a blink, she was there beside him, rage on her face. These monsters will pay. Summoning up all her energy, all her life, she felt the line of power from her heart to her fingertips vibrating inside her, then released it at her foes. When one was trying to get up, she would blast him back down. Beside her, Chesney roared in anger and a firestorm erupted from his hands, engulfing them both. The flames turned from red, to blue, to white. Their screams filled the room, along with the awful stench of burning flesh. Chesney and Medea both screamed together, in unity, in horror, for their lives. There was no great journey now. There was only the terror of death. All she could see was writhing shapes haloed in light and flame. They can still get up. They can still fight. They can still kill me. I can still die. They can still get up. They can still live.
"Medea! Enough!"
Zoran shouted beside her, shaking her. There was more shouting. Abruptly, the lightning stopped. Her arms trembled in the air. She felt so heavy. The pair of agents were no longer recognizable. Black lumps, sizzling and steaming. "Softer," Zoran said, just to her.
"It's done. They can't hurt you anymore. It's over."
She tried. She really tried to hold it in. But at his words, it was like the strings that had held her up were cut, and she fell to the floor and began sobbing. She cried, and tried to speak, but it all came out as terrified gibberish. Her body could not stop alternating between gasping for air and bawling in great wrecking sobs. She didn't know how to describe the feeling. She had been in danger before. She'd almost died before. She'd faced people before, intent on killing her, even. But something about these two killers, they had made her feel hopeless and weak and stupid, and that no matter what she did, it wouldn't be enough, and that she would die. Even with them dead, all she wanted to do was crawl away from them, like even their corpses could hurt her. Just to run and be safe. But nowhere was safe. Everywhere she went, they were going to be awful killers, like these two.
"Shh! It's okay. It's over. You're alive. You're safe,"
Zoran whispered, rubbing her back. Just whispering calming things, rubbing her back. It was helping. It really was. She wanted to say so, to thank him, anything. But still, she couldn't move past the fear, couldn't stop crying to say anything. Eventually, though, it lessened. The crying turned to heavy breathing, and then just to hiccups. She slowly reassembled the broken pieces of herself. She dried her eyes, and stood, knowing there were a few pieces she couldn't find anymore. She looked to Zoran and mouthed him a silent thank you. She had a lot of preconceptions about Zoran when she had first seen him, and at this point they'd all been shattered. He was grim and taciturn, but he always seemed to know just how much this violence affected them, and had done so much to help. She looked to Chesney. He looked scary. If he had turned those eyes on her now, she had no doubt she'd collapse right back to the ground and crawl away. Dan seemed to understand that something had happened with Chesney as well, though he was not nearly as skilled at helping Chesney as Joran had been with her. Chesney looked half dead, maybe even more than that, but he stayed standing and wouldn't take his gaze away from the two huddled shapes, like he wanted to go right back to burning them. What did you say to someone like that? Someone who had been so innocent less than an hour ago, who had never killed a person, and now looked like they wanted to burn the whole building down and just keep burning until they were consumed by fire. There just weren't words for that, and so she didn't use words. She turned him away from the smoldering mess and embraced him in a gentle hug. It was then she could feel the tension in his body, every muscle like a wire pulled to the breaking point. She brought her hand up to the hair on the back of his head and just slowly caressed it, and then rocked a little side to side, a gentle rocking motion, tugging, holding. Chesney let out a breath, and little by little, the tension left his limbs, and then he hugged her back. He whispered,
"Are you okay?" "Yes."
She lied.
"Are you?" "Yeah."
He lied. They let each other go. Wordlessly, she walked past the smoking bodies, these blasphemous stains in this holy site, and pressed her crown into the hollow below the idol of Riga. They left, then, as the lights of the temple seemed to double in intensity. The swaying of the temple ceased abruptly, and it righted itself quickly and firmly. The movement almost knocked her over. There were no smiles or celebration, but the job was done. There was just numbness. The mayor was animated, but she didn't hear a word he said to Chesney and the rest of them, as he handed them their Navdex passports. That night, they lay in their beds, wide awake, exhausted, but unable to let go. The evening leading to now was just a blur. Over and over, the same scene played before her eyes. A beautiful sword, slicing into her, eyes that met hers, completely devoid of mercy. A floor slick with blood. Everyone dying.
"Hey, Chesney, are you awake?"
she asked to the dark.
"Yeah,"
the dark replied. A long silence followed. She didn't even know what she had wanted to say, only knew that she couldn't spend another minute spinning around in her own head.
"I should feel happy, right?"
He didn't respond, so she continued.
"We saved Joran. We saved our lives. We can continue the journey. We won, right?" "Yeah, we won."
There was no emotion in his voice. She bit her lip, trying to hold back a flood of emotion.
Then why am I still so scared?"
A tear fell from her cheek, but she only breathed, and hiccuped. Quiet as a mouse, Chesney slipped from his covers, and padded to her bed. He laid down on the bed beside her over the blankets and wrapped his arm over her shoulder. The shaking of her body that had been building quieted, just as suddenly. She couldn't put into words why, but just him being there made all those fears seem so distant, like he scared them away.
"I'm still scared, too,"
he began.
"I just kept looking at my leg, saying to myself, that's not right, legs shouldn't do that. I have to put it back together. But my hands were so slippery, and I couldn't put the pieces together right, but I just kept trying and trying. I couldn't think of anything else. But then, you appeared, and you just knew what to do. When I saw your face I felt so safe." "Really?" she asked. Her own memories of that moment were etched so deeply into her mind that she could never forget it, but it felt like in that moment she was fueled by terror and adrenaline. "Yeah. I just felt like, because you were there, it would be okay." "Well, I'm glad, because that's kinda how I'm feeling right now. Like, as long as you're there, I know it will get better." Neither of them seemed to know what to say after that. "Hold on. Maybe this isn't the right time, but there's something I want to give you," Chesney said finally. "You, wait, what do you mean?" she stammered. But he got up from the bed,
and rummaged around in his pack before returning to her side. Using the tiniest flame he could produce, he showed her the object. It was a book. She was about to voice her confusion when she recognized the title.
Wait. This is Duskfall.
She sat bolt upright and grabbed it.
Chesney, where did you?
Then she remembered the bookstore in Hagudo. She gasped.
You went back for it.
She didn't know if she wanted to hug him or beat him with the book. Maybe a little of both. He smiled sheepishly.
Yeah, sorry for tricking you. I just thought it was silly for you to deny yourself something like that. If anyone deserves something like this, it's you.
The truth was, it was hard. She saw the book and so desperately wanted it. But she was also so determined to be strong, and fearless, and focused on the task at hand, and there was no time for distractions like that. So, she forced herself to say no, and she'd been sad about it ever since, even though she tried to deny it. Her thoughts would flit back and wonder if someone else had bought it, or if she'd ever find another copy. She hugged the book to her.
Chesney, I don't know what to say. I can't believe you did that for me. Thank you. Dawnkeeper is like my favorite novel. I have reread it so many times the cover is a mess. You've said before.
He adjusted himself to sit cross-legged near her.
What's it about? Do you really want to know? Well, of course. You seem so excited about it. I'm really curious. I don't think I've even read a novel, or at least not one that got someone this excited.
Suddenly, the thought of getting to introduce someone to something that brought her so much joy filled her up to bursting, and she launched into a quiet but animated discussion of all the things she loved about the story, and the characters she loved, and why. They spent the night talking. Mostly, it was her, but he always had a question to keep things going. They both needed this to keep going. There were going to be more hard days, more tears, and pain, but right now, those were distant, meaningless things. In the backs of her mind, she knew, they both knew, this was all to stave off that feeling of being alone and scared. But it was real, too. And clinging to that feeling of something joyful was suddenly the most important thing in the world.